This is the third portion of our talk on the different genres or types of photojournalism. Now, we've previously talked about breaking news photography and feature photography, so now let's talk about something very different than those two, and that is portrait work. Now, portrait work is different than those previous ones, namely because it's posed. That means that you are specifically telling the subject of the photograph how to stand, how to look, or what to do. You are posing the photograph, and because it is specifically being set up as portrait work, that's okay. Now, you can never pose a photograph for breaking news, and you really shouldn't pose photographs for feature stories. But for portrait work, it is actually what you want to do. And that's because you're oftentimes zooming close in on someone's face in order to have their facial expression convey aspects of their personality, the mood that they happen to be in, the story of their life, and some deeper element of who they are. Oftentimes, like I said, they zoom in close on the face and have lots and lots of detail. This is oftentimes accomplished using high-resolution cameras, sometimes in the form of DSLRs, and sometimes even larger than that in full-body cameras. And this is often done in DSLRs by having extremely low aperture in the lenses themselves, talking down into the 1/4 aperture setting. So if you'll notice in this photograph, for example, the person's nose and the area around their eyes is very crisp and clear detail. You can see every little wrinkle. But even the short distance back to their ears and their temple is now blurry and out of focus. You're meant to convey a really sharp sense of detail and lots of depth. Now, in a lot of cases with portrait work, you're going to ask that your subject look directly into the lens. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it's better to be more candid about this. Have the person set up in front of the camera, and then just ask them to stand there, and if they happen to look away, well, then you take their picture when they look away. You can convey a sense of someone's personality this way. Someone who's maybe more direct, or someone who's maybe more sort of to the point. They may look and stare at the camera. Someone who is maybe trying to be a little bit more shy about something may look away from the camera. This is very popular in magazine-style photography. Magazine covers use portraits quite a bit when they are profiling somebody. So, for example, two ways of conveying different personalities through portrait work on magazine covers would be the difference between Vladimir Putin on the left and former President Obama on the right. For the portrait of Vladimir Putin on the left, you notice that he is staring directly at the camera. It's a little bit unnerving. He also has very little emotional expression on his face. Also kind of unnerving. Then again, when you're writing this story, you're writing about the fact that his power in Russia is a little bit unnerving. On the right, we have the photograph of now former President Obama on Rolling Stone. Notice that he's looking down, away from the lens. He has his eyes closed a little bit, and then he's smiling. By not looking directly into the lens, it's slightly less direct. It's slightly more sort of inviting. It's less off-putting, more inviting by design. Now, I really like studio portrait work, and I think it's super fancy and cool. Lots of stuff we've seen up to this point has been that. But the issue is that for a lot of people, including you and probably including a lot of photographers, it's just not reasonable because it requires two things that people don't usually have a lot of, and that is space and money. To do a proper studio portrait setup, you need a whole lot of space. This is a really good example of a studio portrait setup. Notice that you need space to run paper on the background so that you have a clean background behind the subject. You need multiple lights, strobe lights, with multiple reflectors that are set up away from the person whose photo you're taking. You need multiple mono lights that can be set up and give extra additional light as needed. You need cords that will run everything. You need a computer that can coordinate all of this stuff. and that requires an enormous amount of space. You can't usually just do this kind of thing in a spare bedroom. And not only does all of this stuff require tons of space, it also is incredibly expensive. For example, this package of 2 lights that you would use for strobe work in a portrait setup is going to run you about $4,148. But on the good side, it does include a free item, and it looks like a free backpack, so that's pretty cool, I guess. But the real point here is that this kind of stuff is going to be out of your price range, out of my price range, out of most people's price range. But let's say that you still think portrait work is really cool, but you just don't have, for example, about $10,000 and a spare studio. Now, what you want to look at now is what we call street shot photography or street shot portrait work. And this is where you take your camera and you go out into the real world and you use real world settings and real world lightings and real world positionings to take portraits of people who are out in the real world. Now, this is really great for 2 reasons. One, it requires no extra equipment. You just need the camera you already have. And 2, you can tell the story of people way better if you go and take pictures of them and the environments where they actually are. Yes, studio portrait work does have its place and time. When you're doing a fancy magazine cover, of course you're going to need to do that. But for example, let's say you're doing a story on somebody who plays violin in the subway. You don't want to take them out of the subway and go put them in a photo studio. You want to take a picture of them while they're playing violin in the subway. You can tell this is the subway because you can see the subway doors, the subway map in the background. The lighting is kind of dim. It doesn't quite look like good studio lighting. So, of course, there's some issues with the lighting and stuff, but for the most part, this is a really great street portrait shot because it gives a sense of character and it gives a sense of setting about where all of this is taking place. This is one of my favorite of a series of street portrait shots of the nightlife in the city of Hong Kong. Here we have a food delivery driver who's posing for a street portrait shot. I think that lighting of this is really amazing. I love that you can tell, even without seeing the sky, that this is being taken at night because of the way that the neon lights all around the city are reflecting off of the visor on his helmet and reflecting off of his skin and his shirt. If you've ever been to Hong Kong, you know that neon lights at night are sort of ever present and incredibly bright. We get a sense sometimes that because most portrait work is very close to the subject, that it has to be. And that's not necessarily the case. This is a really wonderful portrait shot of that same package of portrait work from Hong Kong. And this is a shop worker at night who's sort of running this little corner convenience store in Hong Kong. You're far away from the subject, but by being farther away, from backing away and taking the picture from farther back, you get a sense of the orderliness of the rest of the store. You see the inventory, you see the bright color. I love the juxtaposition of just how bright and colorful all of the stuff on the shelves is compared to her kind of tired face. She looks a little bit like she's at the end of a long shift of working in this store. Also, another thing I really love about this photograph is that the square of white light coming in the door and illuminating her face. It takes a while to think about, but the square of light is from the fact that the door into the shop would be to the back right of the photographer, and then the lights from outside are shining in and illuminating her face. I really dig this photograph a lot. Now, street portraiture work has been used in photography for a long time, but it wasn't until recently that it started getting sort of well known as part of pop culture. And that's largely thanks to the work of one guy named Brandon Stanton. He's a photographer in New York who invented, you probably guessed it, the blog Humans of New York. It's a wonderful photo blog where the photographer goes around, he'll take a street portrait shot of somebody in their natural setting around New York City, and then asks them usually 1 or 2 questions and records their answers. Usually they have something deep or something interesting to say about their life or the nature of what it means to live in New York, or what the nature of what it means to be a human. And he doesn't do it with any sort of fancy setup. That's a photo of Brandon on the right there. He uses a pretty simple DSLR camera, doesn't use a fancy flash, doesn't use any studio gear. He just goes around using basic equipment and using the natural lighting of the city, using the natural interestingness of the people he's taking pictures of to make it all come together. And this is something you can do no matter where it is you happen to live. There's no reason why you can't do humans of FGCU or humans of Estero or humans of Southwest Florida. All it takes is a camera and a lack of shyness to go talk to people. Also, just so we're clear here, street portraiture work or natural portraiture work has entered into the realm of history before. So we end up with photographs like this. You've probably seen this photograph before. It's a photograph taken by a National Geographic photographer named Steve McCurry. He'll come up again later in this class for a kind of unfortunate reason. But Steve McCurry took this photograph in the mid-1980s when Russia had invaded Afghanistan and was having a land war in Afghanistan, and it had displaced tons of people. And so there was tons of refugees who were scattered around Afghanistan, and this was a photograph from a refugee camp of a young girl. This is a street portrait work because it was done in the refugee camp. This wasn't done in a studio. And so Steve McCurry took this photograph, he brought it back to the National Geographic, who published it on their cover, and it ended up being one of the most iconic photographs in National Geographic history. It ended up representing the plight of displaced people in the war in Afghanistan, at least the first war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. It ended up almost representing the plight of global refugees in general. And there's actually kind of a funny story about this. Steve McCurry didn't get the source's name. He never wrote it down. He never even asked her. So he got back to the United States. This photograph ended up being published, ended up being one of the best-selling editions of National Geographic because people were sort of captivated by this photograph. And people kept asking National Geographic and asking him, what was the name of the girl? How could we send her help? How could we send money to, or send aid? And the thing was, he didn't actually know who she was. He never got her name. So that's a good life lesson, to always make sure you write your sources' names down. Later, they did end up finding her. They found her name. They tracked her down where she was. But it wasn't until the 2000s they were able to do that. So this is portrait work. Always be willing to go out and try it. Sometimes it's a good idea just to bring your camera around and snap off some portrait shots of people and have a little bit of fun with your equipment that way. So the next step with our part 4 is going to be photo illustrations. So more on that in part 4.